This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Bill Nye, CEO of the Planetary Society. Our hosts then discuss the latest news, including tariffs, future collaborations, and proposed NASA cuts.
All right, Bill Nye. I can hardly think of a better known communicator of science, and I'm thrilled to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, as the saying goes. I
Yeah,
read my space news every morning. Uh,
excellent.
I won't say I couldn't live without it, but I'm very happy to have it.
Well, let's get into that. So before we get into sort of space and NASA and Planetary Society, I was hoping we can kind of get a little bit into your own career and sort of maybe kind of like set the table a little bit for us. So like from your days at Boeing to sketch comedy to television to eventually sort of being at the White House to accept the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So you've had this sort of long career, and I'm just sort of wondering had you planned it this way? This was the vision all along. Like how did this manifest?
It manifested. So, first of all, I really like science from being a little kid. And since we're talking about aerospace, I remember very well getting stung by a bee, which was traumatic.
Hmm.
And then I grew up in the city of Washington, D.C. People from Michigan go like this. In Washington, we go like this. I grew up in the city
Right.
of Washington, and I delivered the Washington Post. I was a paper boy back when we had used that expression. And in Ripley's Believe It or Not, it said, it's a story, a version of the story they run from time to time. According to aerodynamic theory, bees cannot fly. And although I was a little kid without much life experience, I remember thinking, bees are flying. Like, the problem's got to be with your theory there.
Right.
And so it led me to question things, to formulate hypotheses of my own and so on. And it's interesting to me to note that how bees fly wasn't really figured out till just about 30 years ago. There's some crazy complexity of these vortices, these whirlpools that
Yeah.
their smaller wings go backwards through. It's really amazing. And they turn their wings all the way over. It's really something.
It's funny you mentioned that because I mean I think you see a lot in sort of modern aerospace, and particularly sort of like in drone markets, like there's sort of a mimicking of nature in
Well,
many.
that's our dream, is to
Yeah.
biomimicry. If we can, anytime you can do that, you're in great shape.
Yeah. And like with the advents of sort of things like nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and even quantum powered technologies are kind of coming to the forefront. I don't know, it just strikes me we're kind of at this like this intersection now in which people often talk about like the golden age of space or aerospace being like the 1960s, and I don't know that's true anymore. It does
Oh,
seem like.
well, we at the Planetary Society like to point out this is the most exciting time in space exploration since the Apollo era.
Yeah.
I mean, without question. The number of rocket launches per week, let alone per year, is higher than ever in history.
Yeah.
And people are talking about going to these extraordinary destinations with these extraordinary instruments and making what we presume will be extraordinary discoveries. So it is the most exciting time.
Let's
since-
get into that then, because
since-
we've seen sort of this evolution now. I mean, you've had a more of a commercial push, obviously, in recent years, but you also see sort of evolving space policy. And I'm like wondering what you, the Planetary Society, like just generally are sort of paying attention to when it comes to sort of a space policy shift in this new administration relative to what maybe we saw in the previous 4 years. Like what stands out? What are you paying attention to?
Well, the big thing we're paying attention to, and the big thing we had our days of action last week. We were on Capitol Hill with 105 members from around the country, and a couple, often people from Canada come here to lobby, or rather to advocate. Lobby is a literal verb, a specialized verb. We advocate for planetary science because there's proposal to cut the Science Mission Directorate 50% by half. This is what NASA does to cut it in half.
Right.
that's big. We don't want that. I don't think it's in anyone's best interest, and it illustrates sort of a fundamental lack of understanding of what goes on at NASA and NASA's mission. And when you talk about commercial activity, talking about mostly low Earth orbit, maybe entirely low Earth orbit, with just a couple exceptions, systems or spacecraft going to the moon. And this is, in a sense, what you want as a taxpayer and voter, as a global citizen, is you want NASA to be doing the extraordinary one-of-a-kind things, sending instruments to Mars, Europa, the moon of Jupiter, Titan, the moon of Saturn, Enceladus. You want NASA to be doing that and just buy rockets from people who make rockets.
Is that where it ends? Because I think, I mean, I've heard this line in terms of like the perspective, commercial is sort of in the immediate vicinity of the Earth, and where the NASA does the big things. But then you see those like Elon Musk talking about sort of the nature of settlements on Mars. You see Peter Beck talking about Rocket Lab's sort of partnerships with MIT in terms of looking at the atmospheres in Venus. And you just start to see the commercial sector pushing further and further and further into space. And I wonder, in the context of not only this administration, but just sort of the growth of the commercial sector, where that go-between is, especially when you have the ISS retiring and more commercial space stations in the works. Like, is science, for the sake of science, maybe a potential victim in some of these things?
Well, people are acting like it's not worth doing, or worth doing at only half the commitment that we have done for decades. And at the Planetary Society, we were very skeptical of that idea. There's no commercial case for exploring the atmosphere in Venus unless somebody is paying Rocket Lab. And what entity would pay Rocket Lab? It'd be space agencies. And so, of course, I'm open-minded. But the reason you go looking at the surface of Mars traditionally has been to look for signs of life. Start with looking for signs of water, and then looking for signs of life. This idea of colonizing or settling Mars, I think, is not very well thought. Is not very well thought through. Nobody settles Antarctica. Yeah. It's not. You don't go there to build a school or a library and so on, because it's too hostile. On Mars, hostile just doesn't do it justice. It's so unlivable for entities like you and me that I don't think anybody's quite taken that into account.
Do you think in terms of the progression of the technology, like unlivable now relative to what, just this enormous acceleration that we've seen in sort of advances of human engineering and technology, and the intersection of those technologies that we mentioned, that long term, that might start to change the math a little bit. And then, if we start talking about not just exploration, but truly sort of multi-planetary human civilizations, is that pie in the sky to you, or is there a real meat on the bone there when we talk about this stuff?
To me, it's meatless bone, but the people disagree with me, and I will ask whoever it is who's going to pay for it. And another example I like to give, I don't know if you've ever been to a middle school gym locker room. It's not a place you want to be after a few weeks on account of the atmosphere. Well, when you live in this dome on this hostile planet, where there's no food or air or water, or virtually no water, this sweaty, bacteria-full environment will not be especially appealing. And the example I give, again, is Antarctica. Yes, people go there to do scientific research, to learn about ocean currents, to learn about ecosystems in this extraordinary environment. In fact, you can even find fossil ancient dinosaurs in certain Arctic and Antarctic environments, but because the Earth used to be fantastically much warmer. But that's not, you don't go there to live.
Right.
It's just, and when you're in Antarctica or the Arctic, you can breathe which is a big deal to most people. And so you can't breathe on Mars.
As most people.
Not like, well, let's just set off nuclear weapons on the North Pole of Mars and it will, like a Star Trek movie, turn into this rich tropical jungle. I just don't think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you'll hear all the time is, well, we have to take care of Earth first. And that's true. But the other thing, we are perfectly suited to living on Earth. We are not suited to living in space or on Mars without taking extraordinary steps. So I'm open-minded, you guys. But what I want is to find evidence of life on one of these other worlds, especially Mars, especially Europa. And so that's why we at the Planetary Society advocate for missions to those destinations.
If there was life, if there were life found in those places, because we've got this Mars sample return mission, we've got these upcoming Venus missions, Europa. There's a lot in the works here, and we even talk about James Webb in terms of how that's sort of scouring the universe. And I want to kind of get into that specifically when we talk about sort of the wonder of space in a way. But philosophically, what would that do with evidence of life elsewhere?
I claim it would change the world. It would change the way everybody feels about being a living thing on Earth. Everybody would feel differently about being alive. Everybody would wonder about consciousness, and everybody would wonder about any connection, one might presume, between life, evidence of life discovered elsewhere, and us. And the old hypothesis, which is just extraordinary, but not can't be dismissed out of hand, is that life started on Mars. Mars, smaller than the Earth, cooled off faster than the Earth, got an ocean before the Earth, got an atmosphere before the Earth. Did life start on Mars before Earth? And then did Mars get hit with an impactor and stuff got tossed into space and landed here on Earth the way Mars rocks still do even now? And you and I are descendants of Martians.
Right.
Extraordinary hypothesis.
Right.
And well worth investigating, and not really a footnote, just to complete this thought. Something of great concern to me personally, as a guy of a certain age, I want to not contaminate the interesting landing sites on planet Mars before we complete an investigation, an assay of what might be fossil Mars probes, ancient Martian life. And stranger still, there's places near the equator where apparently the very salty ice turns to slush. Are there places where Martian microbes are still extant, still making a living? It's an extraordinary hypothesis. And I don't want to go there blasting rocks and dust and human bacteria, gut biome all over the Martian landscape before we investigate this hypothesis.
But I want to ask you about that in terms of like not only sort of the generation or the germination of the Planetary Society itself, but Carl Sagan and yourself. I mean, these are two are sort of luminaries in the field of science communication.
Yeah,
and I wonder though, in the context of now about how people consume information and the technology of how to get these messages out, whether it's harder now or maybe the appetite has changed a little bit in terms of like how do you reach people, and like where maybe has science communication failed in some ways in terms of how we approach these things?
Well, what we've done with everything is stratify society or divide society. So we have very scientifically literate people in one stratum and people who are not engaged in another. And if you don't believe me, look at this vaccine business.
Yeah.
Not changing the subject. Some people accept the centuries-old science of vaccines, and some people don't. And it's, of course, probably in that example, not in anybody's best interest. But the debate about whether or not it's worth spending or committing intellect and treasure, so-called money and time, to space exploration versus solving problems on Earth. That's an old debate. And the answer is you got to keep exploring, or what does that say about you? And so when you say science communication, there are now more science outlets on the internet than there ever were television shows. There are more books, paper books being written now than are being published now than ever in history. So the answer is clearly, without question, it depends.
Right. I guess when I ask this question, I think about younger generations and how they think about not only about space but sort of STEM in general. And so and if you look at STEM, I mean this has been an age-old problem, but it's I think it's starting to manifest and maybe come to a head now in the sense that there's a real question mark in terms of investments in this country, the kind of enthusiasm that you might see for STEM, and how that has sort of downstream effects in terms of those who are graduating. Certain PhDs in places like China and with relative to STEM are almost doubling that of the United States. Now, it's not like a totally one-to-one because this U.S. is still this sort of emporium of scientists from around the world. And so that ripple effect is not just in this country. But I wonder like where it takes us long term in terms of that long-term strategic planning when we think about future generations.
Well, I'm of an age, I'm a product of the Sputnik generation. Sputnik flew in 1957, and then the United States got all excited about science, engineering, and math. And I am a product of that. I'm physics. That's me. I can use a slide rule, for crying out loud. And so one would presume that would happen again. But what's going on right now, as I say, is the stratification of people who get advanced degrees, who pursue science or technical careers, and people who just don't.
Yeah.
And this is a great concern. And everybody understand the reason China has become a rival, the reason everybody's running in circles screaming is because they know the value of space exploration. Taikonauts are national heroes. There's a Chinese space station. There's Chinese missions to the South Pole of the Moon, Chinese missions to Mars. They're doing it because it brings out the best in people or in their industries. They solve problems that have never been solved before. It's inspirational, and we make discoveries that change the way we feel about ourselves and our place in the cosmos, our place in space. They or the Chinese National Space Administration is involved in the same thing, for the same reasons that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is. It brings out the best in us, solve problems that have never been solved before, and seek answers to the two deep questions. Where did we come from? And are we alone in the universe? And if you want to answer those two questions, you've got to explore space. People in China understand it as well as anybody. But a difference is the Chinese government is centralized. And if it's not a dictatorship, it's certainly authoritarian. And people have argued that that's not sustainable. And that sooner or later, it'll all catch up with that government. And sure enough, there's all these entrepreneurs and independent or entrepreneurial space systems in companies in China, space instrument and rocket companies existing as entrepreneurial entities and independent in China. So who knows? It's going to be, as we say in sailboat racing, a near run thing. Who's going to go around the buoy first? We'll see. But for us at the Planetary Society, cutting the NASA science budget by half is not in the national interest.
Yeah. All right. I think that is a good place to leave it. Bill Nye.
One more thing. Thank you. But just
Please.
right now, NASA doesn't have an administrator.
Right.
And so this leads to money not being spent in an organized or thoughtful way, or people's jobs being in limbo, waiting for direction. The reason you have a manager is to manage things. And right now, NASA doesn't have somebody in charge. And we have expressed support for Jared Isaacman. He's flown in space a couple times. He's a real deal. I spoke with him briefly when I was at Blue Origin. We were all waiting for the New Glenn launch. It's getting to be around 2 a.m. And I said, what if we were to find life on another world? And he said, it would change the world. It would change the world. So although he's an astronaut, though he's flown in space and is a big advocate of human spaceflight, he has an appreciation, near as I could tell, he has an appreciation for the discoveries to be made. And I presume the importance of getting organized and bringing the Mars samples back, rock samples back, continuing the Habitable Worlds Observatory effort, getting the Nancy Grace Roman telescope flying, and coordinating with space agencies around the world to keep the deep space network of telescopes running and maintain the United States' lead as the preeminent space agency. So you need a leader, and we're hopeful that if not Mr. Isaacman, somebody gets appointed soon.
I think that is a good place to leave it. Bill Nye, the Planetary Society, thanks so much for joining us. This is just, I have to tell you, this is just a real pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Carry on.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
All right. There is a lot to talk about this week and last week and next week. It seems like the industry is moving very fast in terms of just the nature of what's happening within the administration, the commercial sector, and just like everything in between. But Jason, I wanted to start this off. I'm just chatting with you about tariffs because I mean we've seen a lot of activity. These reciprocal tariffs, these 90-day pauses, the tit for tat escalations with China. And I think just like given the sheer nature of how fast everything is moving, it's kind of hard to draw any sort of enduring level of analysis in terms of what's happening here. But one thing seems to be clear is that prices are going up for the space industry. And I guess I wanted to maybe just kind of toss it over to you to kind of kickstart like what you're seeing, what this means long term, if there's opportunities here, what are the drawbacks, the geopolitical implications wrapped in with the commercial sector. Like, what's your sense of it all at this point?
Yeah, this is very much an evolving story. The tariff situation, it's been tough to cover as a journalist. I can only imagine what it must be like for an investor or a business leader that must make, long-term bets and make decisions on where to spend money and manage supplies in a constantly changing environment. The other day, I did a deep dive into what tariffs mean for the space sector. I interviewed multiple sources and experts and got some really good solid analysis. And then I thought I'd check social media just in case I missed anything. And what do you know? The whole situation completely changed. I had to rewrite the entire thing. So I mean, it's tough, but also it's never been more important to cover the twists and turns in all of this. But should we start with a quick primer on what tariffs actually are?
Yeah, please. Let's start
Yeah,
there.
okay. I know there's some confusion about it sometimes. So they're essentially an import tax that an American company has to pay to the US government on top of whatever they're paying a foreign company to buy a product, material, or whatever, and then bring it across the border if that thing is part of the tariff, because there also can be exceptions. So these American companies have a choice. They can find a decent alternative if there is one within the US to buy instead. They can absorb the fee somehow, which is easy said than done. But if you're a big company with cash reserves, then okay. Or you can pass it on to consumers by raising prices. And that's a very basic explanation because many supply chains are very intricate and global. For the space industry especially. So, there are knock-on effects to consider and to get your head around. But also tariffs are not a new thing. During his first term, President Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from China. and other countries targeting goods such as steel, aluminum, and electronics. And the subsequent Biden administration largely maintained those with some adjustments, even increasing them on certain Chinese imports to protect American industries from unfair competition. But the latest round of tariffs by Trump and that have been proposed and in some cases have come into effect that take it to another level. We're talking significant increases for dozens and dozens of trade partners. Now, like I said, the situation is constantly evolving. Some have been paused, are getting refined, and they target certain goods and so on. But there are still some key things to keep in mind. First, it has caused a great deal of financial uncertainty. The stock markets are incredibly volatile right now. Business leaders are not quite sure how things are going to play out. So in many cases, there is certain uncertainty, and that's the thing you asked about long-term issue. That's the thing that's kind of sticking. It's the constant as things change from one day to the other, and
Well, so
well,
much,
that
so much of this
yeah.
industry too. I mean, it's such a commercially centric sort of era now in terms of what Space 2.0 reflects. So not only the nature of sort of uncertainty in terms of investment climate, but you talk there's a lot of ifs in that statement, right? If we can pass it on to consumers, if that there's a sensibility to develop domestic supply chains. I guess the thing that I wonder about, and just in terms of the long-term structure of this, is that can economic policy incentivize a move toward domestic supply chains? And I don't think that happens quickly if it happens at all, frankly. And so the thing I wonder about is sort of long-term global competitiveness in terms of these companies, some of which are big and might be able to absorb costs, and some of which might enjoy new federal subsidies to kind of offset some of those effects, but some won't. And so what does that mean? Kind of long
Yeah,
term.
yeah, yeah. I mean that's the silver lining in all of this. While everyone I've spoken to have pointed to near-term financial strain, ultimately high tariffs should bring more production and capability to the United States. I mean, that's the way the market works, if it's cheaper and easier to do so. But what does that mean? Does that mean loads more jobs? I'm not so sure because there's also a shift toward automation, building
Sure.
satellites and satellite parts with robots and getting humans out the picture.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of your guests on this podcast have talked about hiring engineers versus building robots in the near future.
Sure. No, I mean I think it's been a question not only within the space sector, but sort of the automotive industry, dating back for decades now. So, that combined with sort of the nature of quote unquote free trade, I think it seems to be a hallmark. One of the things I do wonder about also is just the other side of this, right? In terms of the implications for strategic or chief geopolitical rivals such as China. And in the past we've seen what some of the nature of what tariffs have engineered is sort of a lessening of reliance on what Western investments and parts, and the capacity to do homegrown investment. I mean, we saw that in terms of deep seek, and I think there's a interconnectedness in terms of some of these advanced technologies and how they kind of marry with aerospace in a really interesting way. And I wonder in terms of like the nature of the competition when major economies such as the United States and China restrict trade and there's less of a reliance on them, that creates a little bit more of a dangerous environment, especially when you have this many assets up in orbit.
Yeah, it's certainly when we talk about geopolitical tensions, this is definitely increasing those tensions. And interesting, you mentioned China. They are the one thing to also consider are the retaliation and this is a trade war, So and China are not only increasing tariffs on the US, they're also moving to restrict the supply of rare earth metals and magnets, and that could cause a lot of pain for the space industry because China basically has a monopoly on refining rare earths that the global space industry relies on. And I've got a list here. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce some of these names, but these rare earths are used in applications such as propulsion systems for moving spacecraft and satellites in the extreme conditions and vacuum of outer space. They're using phosphors for some avionic displays, radiation shielding materials, laser crystals and optics used for communication systems. It's a lot, and we don't know how much of this has been stockpiled, and that would definitely increase pressure, not just on the US, but other countries too that rely on these, these incredibly key materials. Not that they need a lot of them, but they are critical for certain applications.
And I think that that plays sort of really well into a transition to a story that you recently did at a symposium that sort of touches on what can sort of only be described as sort of this growing call of international partners to maintain those international bonds
Mm.
amidst not only the context of what seems to be sort of this burgeoning trade war, albeit it's now restricted and then expanded. It almost seems like we have this bit of an accordion in terms of how to cover these things in terms of the
Mm,
nature
mm, mhm,
where tariffs are and are not applied. But it's also married with a sort of a changing geopolitical stance in Europe that we've seen. And in the nature of the Artemis Accords and the real, which is, we should remind people was started on the first Trump administration. I mean, the strength of the Artemis Accords, in my mind, it seemed to be the sense of like almost this overwhelming nature of international collaboration that creates almost this like fait accompli in orbit when you talk about sort of rules and regulations. And some of that is in question now,
mm.
given the nature of the political stance, and particularly in terms of the trade positioning. And I wonder in the context of your reporting, you know, like there's a transatlantic partnership angle here, but it's bigger than that in many ways, right? Like the sense of maybe a bit of worry amongst international partners. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. What
No,
do
no, no,
you?
you're right. You're absolutely right. And people have long pointed to how unique space is for transcending geopolitics. It has historically been a domain where countries put their tensions aside in favor of cooperation. I mean, look at the International Space Station, where the US and Russia have maintained a long-standing relationship, regardless of what may be happening below. However, the onset of the Ukraine war in 2022 marked, I think, a turning point in some international space collaborations. European Space Agency, for instance, suspended its cooperation with Russia on the ExoMars rover mission as a direct response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. So, yeah, in the context of an escalating global trade war, it was interesting to see, what was it, six countries reaffirm the value of international partnerships in space. Well, it's funny. I think it was the head of Germany's space industry who called on the US to keep its commitment to Artemis lunar missions, even though Mars is becoming, an increasing priority within the administration. But he said something about how he didn't want to picture the next foot on the moon being anything but an American foot because Europe is concerned about ceding ground to China. So Europe wants global space collaboration, but maybe not so much with China and Russia in that
But,
point.
but at the
Yeah.
same time, I mean, you've seen outreach efforts for the International Lunar Research Station with regard to what China is doing. You see,
Mhm.
different plays in terms of economic partnerships that China has maintained. Let's say in Andean countries, such as Argentina, recently economic trade deal that was or trade for pact that was inked with Brazil in terms of sort of lessening sort of the reliance and the questions about sort of long-term viability of the dollar as a sort of a global standard. I mean that these are questions that never really had come to the forefront before. And now I mean, there's just all these downstream effects in terms of what a trade war and the politics, how that will impact new space and the commercial nature of it. And then on top of this, I've often said this before, like I can't think of any other government bureaucracy that has T-shirts with those worming red letters that you'll see in really any part of the world. And of course, I'm talking about NASA here. And yet NASA itself is changing pretty significantly, I would think, at least in terms of the proposals. And we've seen in terms of the proposed budget, 50% cut in some of the science budget. I think it was a 20% overall cut to the agency's budget across the board, but like real questions about some legacy efforts in astrophysics and planetary science, and Hubble and James Webb would remain, but questions about Nancy Grace Roman telescope are kind of out there, and so we seem to have be not only in terms of all these politics, geopolitics that are happening, and not only sort of questions about sort of where the commercial sector will go with regard to the impacts on trade, or excuse me, impacts on supply chain, but the nature of an asset itself is sort of like evolving. And in many ways, I've heard some people say, well, NASA sort of needed to evolve in the nature and having it established itself a little bit more of a client relationship. But you know, those science enthusiasts, especially when it comes to the Nancy Grace Roman telescope. I mean, this is a telescope that just has this huge range of field, and you know, it's an infrared spectrum, and so it's capturing a lot of objects that we just didn't see, and that includes asteroids that don't reflect a lot of light. So like there's a lot of practical science sort of involved in these things as well. And sort of I wonder in terms of the context, like what kind of conversation we'll be having a year from now, because it's not just NASA, right? I mean, Congress plays a pretty big role in this. You know, historically wields the power of the purse, and you know, we've seen pushback in places like Maryland and Texas. So it's a head scratcher in many ways.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, we're getting conflicting signals when it comes to NASA. You know, publicly, there's a big push for NASA and US space on the world stage. Yet we're seeing moves behind the scenes to potentially slash spending.
Yeah.
My colleague Jeff House recently published a very insightful article on that, and I encourage people to check that out. And you know, it's also interesting to see the potential for cost cutting for defense, which is of course a massive revenue driver for the commercial space industry. I mean, some defense programs could receive increased funding, particularly in national security and military satellite applications, but other defense areas could be in line for cuts after Trump proposed, I think it was $50 billion reduction in the upcoming defense budget.
Right.
So we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out and whether there is an impact for the space industry there. But yeah, the conflicting signals. It's hard to make sense of it all.
Well, in the context of what you just said, satellites, let's talk about that, because I mean, I think there's some interesting developments here in terms of Amazon, Kuiper, and you know, you reported on this quite a bit in terms of, you know, not only just that in and of itself, but sort of like what that represents in terms of the diversity of the landscape, which I think is sort of an important component to this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, more delays for Amazon's plans for more than 3,200 satellites to take on Starlink's dominance in LEO broadband. So they were due to launch a batch of 27 satellites last week, but that was scrubbed because of weather. I think we're now looking, I just saw something toward the end of the month. And Amazon at one point had been looking at launching their first batch of operational satellites last year, but have been held up for reasons that they aren't talking about. But I mean, they design these satellites from scratch, you know, and they set up the factories and have to hire many skilled people. It's not easy, but you know, the first two prototypes launched in 2023 and apparently passed all their tests with flying colors. Yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned it because Amazon have committed, you know, more than $10 billion to Project Kuiper. And it just shows that even with all the money in the world, sometimes it isn't enough to get things off the ground or to speed things up in this industry.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that wraps us up for today. Jason Rambo, I thanks, you know, for filling in for Mike. And you know, your reporting has been a hallmark of space news for quite some time. So thanks for being a part of this.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Tune in next week for the latest edition of Space Minds. And we will see you then. Thanks so much.